Waiver wire strategy and how to avoid the chop and guillotine leagues. That is what we are talking about today on RotoViz Overtime. We're going to work through some of Shawn's content over on rotoviz.com, where he talks through some of our moves in a guillotine league that we are taking place in. That was with the RotoViz OT listeners, also one that him and Ben have Stealing Bananas team in. So a lot of stuff that we're going to talk through in terms of the overall waivers from week one and how they broke down potentially, what our strategies are moving forward as we record this prior to waivers closing on Wednesday. We'll give a bit of a bigger picture view into general waiver wire strategy and how to manage it, Shawn, across the different formats in terms of targeting players, because this is a format where you need to win now. You need to get those points every week. I joked when we were in the draft, you basically need to be the second worst team every week and you'll avoid the chop. And there was a case where, you know, I looked at the projections heading into week two, Shawn. I was projected for the lowest points. Some of those players performed admirably in week two. That led to me finishing higher up the leaderboard, which was a nice move. But it is a situation where we have held our dollars for ourselves, $1,000 budget through those opening waiver wire runs. So we're going to talk a little bit about our discussion here today and what people can do moving forward. This format, Shawn, has been so much fun to jump in and do. We mentioned we did a charity one previously, and then we have done a couple of them since. But this year we did a RotoViz Overtime one, and we are working our way through it. One team chopped every week, and that leads to a situation where then at the end of the season, one person will have all the bragging rights when it gets to those playoffs. But with each team that gets cut, those players then are added on to the waiver wire. Then you have to make the decision, is this the week to spend those dollars? Because if the team that picks them up or another team spends their money, then they get cut. You have the advantage later on as more and more prime players get added to the pool as the season goes along. You will get into a situation in week 10 or 11, if you're still in it, where you're kind of looking at the waiver wire and you're like, I would love to have that player on my roster, but I just I can't do it. I can't cut some of the other names that are on there, because you get a superstar filled team as you move through. Shawn, week two, we're heading into week three. What are some of the things that we need to be thinking for the guillotine leagues, but in general, I think for waiver wire strategy at this point? You know, we talked on our show on Wednesday about all the injuries that have happened around the league, some of the positional changes, but usually that leads to, you know, lots of opportunity, even in redraft waiver wires, where you're like, whoa, this guy is breaking out, or this guy's hurt, so I'm going to pick up this guy. It feels like there isn't a lot of that, you know, at the level of a week one, week two, week three of previous seasons. And I guess that is also down to partially the lower scoring element of the NFL over those opening weeks, and projecting things moving forward. Waiver wire, how should people be attacking it? And, you know, situations where it's not very exciting for 2 weeks, maybe in week three, people just go and blow all their money. How should people be patient but also aggressive as the season moves on here?
So one of the things I wanted to dive into in this piece was the waiver wire from a variety of different perspectives. Obviously, the guillotine leagues are unique because really exciting players are going to be dumped back into the pool. Now, one of the things that has actually happened over these first couple of weeks is that so many of the players who have been chopped in the league that you and I are doing and in the league that I'm doing with Ben come from teams where the first or second round pick was injured. And so the Christian McCaffrey team has been chopped in both leagues already. The Puka Nacua team has been chopped. In a couple of instances, specifically in our league, the team with both Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts have been chopped. Now, the team didn't have both, but the teams with both of those guys have already gone out. And that was something I covered a little bit in the strategy piece to start, which was you probably don't want to pay up for quarterbacks in this format. You could easily see a scenario in which our philosophy about trying to hit on the last of the kind of QB1 tier would have not worked out, because with scoring down so much, if you did have a few guys who had really separated and you had a feeling that they were going to continue to separate, that would be exciting. But what we've gotten from Josh Allen has been very disappointing. Certainly in week 2 it was, where his team got chopped. We're not really seeing that dynamism from Jalen Hurts that would suggest that he's going to be an absolute world beater. Patrick Mahomes has been disappointing. CJ Stroud has been disappointing. If you are trying to hit on the end of that tier, you have guys like Jordan Love, who's gotten hurt, Caleb Williams, who is doing very, very little. But the other players there not necessarily killing you either. In terms of a Dak Prescott, the guy's a little bit lower. We thought might be able to perform in an emergency. Players like a Jared Goff or a Brock Purdy, they're not doing things that would necessarily move the needle significantly. Within that context, there are just so many different ways in which hitting the end of the QB1 tier or even dipping down into the QB2 tier will work. It takes a very specific type of outcome for the elite QBs to work, in part because of the specific things that have happened and because they were paired up with players who were injured. It hasn't worked so far in these guillotine leagues. And the problem that you have in the guillotine league, which I think is unique and fun, is just these leagues are so deep that you're not going to be able to fill out a starting roster if you also have that QB in there. Colm, the other thing that's kind of interesting, and it's fun to look at your roster because you basically don't have a viable starting running back. But with the depth of this and with trying to avoid the chop of being that dead last team, what you're looking for are big performances, and you got that in the form of Malik Neighbors, Zay Flowers, George Kittle. That actually allowed you to score toward the top, even though you had some pretty poor scores in there as well. You're going to have more chances to hit on that difference-making running back or wide receiver if you go about it from that perspective. So one of the things that we're now looking at in waivers this week is this sort of troubling dynamic where the most exciting players in most cases are guys that you can't really rely on in the short term because they're hurt. So you wouldn't want to bid high for that because there's a strong likelihood that they will be re-chopped. So if you want someone like a Christian McCaffrey or Puka Nacua, you would go and get them after they have been chopped again. The other thing that you probably don't want to do is that even though names like a Josh Allen and a Jalen Hurts are available, as we move through the season, the teams that survive tend to end up with 2-3 good options at QB, and then you can just stream your individual players from that threesome. And it's not that you're necessarily going to be able to manage the ceiling in a given week from a Josh Allen or a Jalen Hurts, but that's probably not going to be the defining element of whether or not you get chopped. So I also wouldn't recommend bidding very aggressively at QB. Colm, when we take this back into the realm of home leagues or FFPC types of leagues, I do think that we want to have a general concept of what we're trying to accomplish when we go and make waiver bids. Now, one of the things I do want to note here is that you can have two different levels of thinking that you're working through at the same time. One is to think through the potential acquisitions from a big picture perspective and have some rules of thumb and have some bidding guidelines that help you, generally speaking, across weeks and across years. You also want to be taking every individual player on his own terms and think about how it fits with my roster and what I'm trying to do and what will work to get him. So the rules of thumb that I'm going to give are not necessarily rules that I would say you have to apply in every single situation to every single player. That would be similar to zero RB or thinking about the running back dead zone or thinking about how you want to approach the QB position or thinking about bully tight end. All of those rules of thumb are guidelines to help you draft better from a big picture perspective, to understand what has worked across seasons, understand the types of constructions that will give you an edge most of the time and that you want to build toward. it's not a situation where when you're an individual draft that you're going to pass up something that will help you win that league because you have these overall guidelines. So I think that that's an important thing to kind of note before we get into it. But Colm, I've suggested that there are 4 different types of objectives that we might have when we head into the bidding. For me, that would be 1, that I need this player at all costs. 2, that I really want this player. 3, that I want this player, but I don't want to break the budget. And then 4, I'm okay adding this player for free. We'll go into how I think you should approach that in just a second. But are those categories that seem to reflect or represent some of the things that you're thinking about when you're going after these players? Or do you have some different categories that you like to think through? Is something like that, and trying to understand what the player will do for your roster, is that something that you're working through in addition to obviously just trying to figure out, like, I mean, who's available, who has value, how can I make my roster a little bit better by either adding a stud, which would be a very big move, or simply adding to the depth, which you never know when you're going to need that depth.
Yeah, so there's the case of, like, I think you like splitting it into those 4 options is the perfect way to do it. I think when people are doing their waivers in general, they may just have like, I want that player or I don't need that player, rather than, you know, the bigger picture as to like what that player is going to be like in multiple weeks down the line, what the season is going to develop into. You know, I think for your general fantasy football player, it'll be that player has scored this amount of points through the opening 2 weeks. I want to get them on my roster. Or that player has not performed. Like, one of the things post waiver wire that I do in all my leagues, I'm sure you do too, but I want to see the players who get cut. You know, like, for example, in this, Dalton Kincaid is on the waivers, but he hasn't performed. But like, when people go in and look at the charting on the site as a default, a lot of them are going to be done by, if it's done by percentage ownership, he's going to be high. But if it's done by points to date on the season, depending on what site you're playing for, like, it's going to be way down. Like, you have chances to pick up players from those perspectives as well. So that's more post waiver run. But I think you need to be thinking, like, is this player going to be a bench player for me? Is this player going to be a player that gets into the starting lineup immediately? Is he a flex play? And then when it goes into the guillotine part, it's like, how much impact is this player going to have right now, and how does the budget affect as the season goes on? The budget part, though, and the way that, you know, we're splitting them down here is, do I need this player at all costs? Well, is this player somebody who's going to completely define your season if it goes right? If you don't get him, is that going to be a case that your season could go in the opposite direction because you don't have him on the roster? Then you have the players where you're talking about, like, I really want this player. Is it that you really want them or you really need them? People have asked me questions at different points in my life, like, do you want this or do you need this? Like, if you need something, that's a different thing. Does your roster need it, or is it like, yeah, that'd be nice to have?
Colm, we always need it.
Yeah. Yeah. So there is those kind of things, and then the other part is break the budget. Do you get into a panic situation? So is your team at this point 0-2, and do you think, if I don't get this player now, I'm 0-3, my season's over? And then maybe something big comes up in week 4 where you don't have the budget to compete, or maybe you pick up an injury, a quarterback, and need to, you know, try and get that quarterback off waivers, and maybe there's competition for it and you miss out on him. So, but my favorite one is probably, am I okay adding this player for free? So this means that you kind of want the player on your roster, would like it, but you don't want to spend the capital on it, and you hope that he may sneak through. And that's the one where, like, when the waivers run on a Wednesday, you can go in and have the, you know, the free pickup point, first come, first serve. They're the sort of players that, like, you just need to have the discipline of, I'm not going to go and put, you know, $50 down, or, you know, 5% of your budget on those names. So the way you've split them up, I think is perfect. And the other part that I think that you're going to talk about now is a bit like I was talking through the kind of logical side there of, if you want the player or you have to have him, what is the strategy to adding him? Because I joked at the end of the Wednesday edition of the show that I missed out on 2 different bids because I had the exact same amount as the highest bidder in SFB, one of those being Jordan Mason, who now, Shawn, 3 weeks later, I would really appreciate having him on that roster. But how are you deciding how much budget allocation to spend? And I think you've split this up very well in the article itself.
So the first category here is going to be fairly unique because it doesn't come into play that often, and you need to understand it doesn't come into play that often. But this is the I need the player at all costs. And if you do need the player at all costs, then my recommendation is to go get that player. And to do that, I'm going to try and estimate the likely winning bid and then add 100 because I don't want to just barely lose them, as you mentioned with Jordan Mason. This is probably only going to come into play every 5-6 years. And so you want to understand that it's unique, but when that unique opportunity arises, you don't want to miss it. So the ones that really stand out to me were last year after week 1 with Puka Nacua, and he was surprisingly available in quite a few of the FFPC leagues that I had drafted in. And in kind of working with different folks who were dialed in to where people were, it seemed like 650 was probably going to be the bid. And yet we bid over 800, and in a couple of cases, or maybe one case, like 903 to make sure. It doesn't mean that you're going to be right, but you can't afford to miss on a player like that who has the potential to essentially be an extra, borderline first round pick. The other name that really jumps out to me where I bid in the mid 900s was Alfred Morris back during his rookie season, right, where he has the big week 1. And certainly if you had 0 RB teams and you're looking at Alfred Morris there, you're like, this could be the thing that makes everything work. There's one other player that I haven't been able to figure out who it was as I worked through this in the last 24 hours. If I do find that name, I will let people know, because I think it's interesting to think through not only the hits, but the misses. Because one of the reasons that Puka and Alfred Morris ended up being so valuable is that they played the season without getting hurt. And you don't know that that's going to happen. And when you spend your entire budget and the player does get hurt or doesn't fulfill the thesis that you had, then you're much more limited. But I still want to take that risk when the player can be completely and totally roster changing. Now that's going to stand in pretty stark contrast to how I'm trying to do the rest of the bidding, where that second category is I really want this player. In that case, I want to estimate the likely winning bid and then bid like 67% of it. So I'm intentionally bidding below what I think will work because I don't know what the winning bid is going to be. And if you bid below what you're expecting the winning bid to be, then you put yourself in position to pick that player up and in subsequent weeks pick similar players up at a discount to what you think will probably get the job done. And you create exposure to those players at a lower rate than maybe you anticipated or that you would have paid if you simply go all in on a lot of these guys. Because again, this is a player you really want, but it's not the player that you have to have at all costs.
And the other part, Shawn, on that is you do see, like, if people are doing this in their home league, it's like a 1-to-1, but you will see it across platforms. But on the FFPC every week, when you see what certain players have gone for, the range of bids can be, anywhere from like a higher price player that goes maybe for $600 or $700 in some leagues, may go for 50 to 70 in another league. It can be quite drastic. So my question that I'm thinking as we're doing this, that the listening audience may have, is when you're doing those kind of projections of what the winning bid would be, what are some of the factors you're putting into that?
Well, I think you are going to look at what the guy did and what the environment is and what has been the bidding pattern in the past. So one of the things that makes it a little bit easier for me is that I've been involved in FFPC style leagues since about 2008. And so with 15, 16, 17 years, what have you, of doing this process, you get a pretty strong intuitive sense of where people are going to go with it. But then the thing that you mentioned is that within that intuition, you have a very wide range of what can actually happen in your league. So if listeners are trying to figure out what those ranges are likely to be, we have a fantastic tool. Now, it's going to be retrospective, right? It's going to tell you what happened in the previous week. And in some cases, you're like, well, what I really need to know is what's going to happen in the future week. But working through those results will give you a sense of the range and what's happening. So in week 2, Tyler Johnson was added on 1,846 teams in the main event and in the football guys version, which is the 350 version, right? Dropped only 4 times. But the spreads are very interesting because the median winning bid was 69. The average winning bid was 86. The low winning bid was 1. And the high winning bid was 500.
Yeah.
Now, Alan Lazard was added almost as many times. The median winning bid there is 100. The average winning bid is 121. The high winning bid was 998. And the low winning bid was 1. So you have this environment in which, you know, maybe in your league it was going to take 999 to get over the person who bid 998. But certainly in some leagues, 2 would have gotten it done. Jeff Wilson, a vaguely similar kind of deal where the high for him was 888 and the low was 1. So anywhere in between there, it could have been the right answer. The median was 109. And that kind of brings me back to the third category, which is that, you know, I want this player, but I don't want to break the budget. And in that case, I would say estimate the likely second place bid and bid half of that. So one of the things that I liked about my bidding in week 2, however you want to look at how the weeks are designated, but last week in the guillotine leagues, was that in many of these cases, my bid was about half of what the second highest bid was. And I think that that gives you a sense that you're probably in the right range to where your bid is reasonable on a guy to potentially pick off a value, but that you had a sense of where the player was going to be, a player that maybe, you know, again, you didn't exactly want, but would help. And you could get him at a decent price if the rest of the league had a different view. I mean, one of the things that you're dealing with in an individual league is you're not bidding against the entire community of bidders. And when you're in your home league, you're not bidding against every ESPN league or every CBS league, every Yahoo league, every NFL.com league. You're bidding against just the 11 other players. And especially in home leagues, 5 or 6 people may have life things that are happening to where they can't bid, right? So you don't want to even be thinking about like all 11 people are going to bid in this league. So then you work back to, you know, how can I make the most bets? And so then that final category of I'm okay adding the player for free is just very literally you're going to bid like $1 to $3 on those guys. And as we just saw, even the players who were the most coveted players last week in FFPC leagues, in some leagues, a $2 or $3 bid would have gotten them. In a lot of these cases, I strongly believe, again, from the experience of having played through this a lot of years and worked through a variety of rosters in those years, is that the players who tend to go, or that we tend to think, okay, well, I do like this guy. He will help the back of the roster. I'm going to bid like 200 because there are going to be a lot of people bidding in that 100 to 150 to 175 range. So many times you find that that's the player you want to cut again the next week, or that a bid of 25 would have done it, or a bid of 2 would have done it. When you make a lot of these $1, $2, and $3 bids or add players for those prices, you get to make a lot more moves and you get to see a lot more people, but you also save money for the truly difference-making bids, and you put yourself kind of in this mindset of I'm not simply cutting the players that I originally kind of placed my bet on, that I had a strong thesis for, when maybe that is the guy that you want. I mean, that's something that we also need to think through. Is that a week from now, you may have to bid 700 to get back the player that you had originally. We see that happen actually more frequently than maybe is intuitive, which is that your guy blows up a week late. There were certainly plenty of leagues in which I cut Jalen Tolbert last week. And I don't think that that's a mistake necessarily. The better game that he had in week 2, we don't know that that is going to be any more of a strong signal than what we got in week 1. But there is an element where if you spent 200 to replace Jalen Tolbert with a player who is very similar, or in the case of an Alan Lazard, almost certainly inferior, then you've both given up the money and you've given up the player who has a better outcome anyway, because we weren't able to maintain the restraint that's going to help us in the long term.
There's going to be leagues, Shawn, over the coming weeks, maybe not this week, but next week or the week after, if things, don't turn around and say at the running back position, the likes of a Tyjae Spears or a Jalen Warner or a Chase Brown, where people may not have the roster depth and may get frustrated and, might not be a league that's, a high value league to them. Let's say it's a home league where the roster spots are less, but there's chances they're going to get, cut to add somebody else, another running back that's like the hot property that week for, this player may break out or may have an opportunity, but then you're going to be back.
Well, Colm, we're recording this again on a Wednesday and it's going to release on a Friday, and sort of knowingly discussing some things from last week, and we'll get a new free agent session. But the thing that you're mentioning there sparks this thought for me that guys like that, maybe not those two names, although maybe, are going to be cut for Kareem Hunt.
They will be.
And
I'm going to spring this on you, Shawn.
Are you going to rather have Spears or are you going to rather have Kareem Hunt?
Shawn's not on Twitter, so I don't know if he's seen this news, but the Chiefs, while we've been recording, have signed Keontae Ingram to the active roster. So we may not see Kareem Hunt, but people may be putting in those last-minute bids for Ingram, and if they think that something might happen there. So people will splash, and it will be something they come back to regret. But the other part I want to highlight there, Shawn mentioned the $1 to $3 bids. Drafting in teams with Shawn, that was something that I've really added to my game over the last, say, 5 years, is putting in those $1 bids just, to add those names and not overstretching yourself. But the other part of that, Shawn, that you're talking about is, players might go into that, I want this player, but don't want to break my budget. You might think that he's going to go for $600, but in your league, people may overlook that player for a variety of reasons, like Shawn has already mentioned. But don't leave those players with no bids. Don't be, oh my, I can't believe he went for $30, and I didn't bother bidding at all. So do your due diligence and put in those bids where, if you get him at a certain price, that's going to be fantastic for you in your roster. But don't just be a case of like, oh, there's no chance that he goes for $50. He's going to go for $500. So just don't bet at all. I think that you should always, put in those bids at the lower price in case it does come through. Like you mentioned, the wide range of outcomes in leagues like the FFPC, where there's large volumes of, entry fees. Yeah.
And, you just want to be aware of what the tiebreaker rules are, aware of what's likely to happen. There are going to be other managers who are good at the format who will also be bidding, 1 and 2 on guys they don't think they have a shot at. But as they go through, they're filling out their bids that way. If you have one of the 2 or 3 highest scores and you're likely to lose the tiebreaker, then you bid 2 instead of 1. So when the 2 people finish with the $1 bid, you don't lose the tiebreaker on someone who's probably worth like 300, right? You wouldn't have wanted to lose it based on that, but you still maintain that discipline of, I'm going to bid 1, I'm going to bid 2, I'm going to bid 3. I'm not going to start bidding 15 or 25 or 50 in the case where what I'm really looking to get is the player at 2 or 3, because every additional dollar that you spend there is one that you can't use to address kicker streaming, defense streaming, QB injuries late, setting your roster up for the playoff sprint with the right kickers and defenses, and still having the bidding stash to make the big play if that ever develops. It doesn't mean that it ever will, and it doesn't mean that you have a good opportunity for someone where, again, let's say you've estimated the value at 600 and you're going to bid 200. to try and pick that value off, because maybe you're in a league where no one believes they're going to be the team that gets the person. And so maybe 200 does pick the guy off. But again, when you bid 200, it's because you expect the winning bid to be 600, not because you expect the winning bid to be 198.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a good point. So hopefully we've talked through a lot of different elements. I think it's been a good strategic discussion that can be, taken across all the different formats. But the Guillotine League does add that additional element that I think is a lot of fun in terms of the big names getting added to the pool every week. So I think, Shawn, I'm going to pretty much hold this $1,000 budget and hope to make it sneak through as at least the second worst team again this week. And then we'll see what we do next week. But when we are on the topic, I meant to mention this off the top, but we are going to do another one of these drafts over the coming weeks. And if you are interested, even if you're in the first one, or if you've missed out and you want to get in, you can reach out to me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland, or send an email over to overtimeireland@gmail.com. We will be running another one of these in the coming weeks. The great thing about the Guillotine Leagues is you can set it for the amount of weeks basically that you want it to run for. Then you need that amount of people involved. So you can set it that it will finish at that fantasy playoff time of the year. So I would recommend people head on over and check out that format. You can check it out at guillotineleagues.com. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check all of Shawn's work over on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.